Hospital Heaven by Kieran Marsden. When she woke, for the briefest second, she thought she was in heaven. There was a bright light, or maybe it was just because she'd been cast into darkness. How long she'd been out, she didn't know. There were people in the room, but she couldn't see them. Everything was a blur. She could hear them, but it was a mumble, like she was underwater. And as she tried to move and speak, her body wouldn't allow it. It would take an Olympian effort and probably kill her. So, she fell back to sleep. In an indistinguishable amount of time, she woke again. There was a tingling feeling in her forearm. Someone was close to her, right over her. Because they were so close, she could make out slight characteristics. It seemed to be a girl, probably quite young, in a uniform of white. And she said something, but she couldn't make it out. Maybe it ended in okay. It then came back to her. Not a sudden epiphany, but as a drip. A face. A man. Yes. He was why she was here. The man she hated more than anything in the world. The man she had married. But why? It wouldn't come. She just knew he was the reason for this. And, as a little more time passed, and details became a little bit more revealed, she now realised she was in a bed, and that girl had been a nurse. She was in hospital. And slowly, she drifted off again. Someone was touching her arm, shaking her slightly. Slowly her eyes opened, and she knew what they were saying.
Courtney. Courtney.
It was her name. That hurt her in some way, that she remembered him before her own name. They said something, but it was a word she couldn't really make out. She felt like the blur in front of her was a man. Then slowly, something came towards her face and touched her lips. A metal spoon rested there. When the taste of salt touched her tongue, instinctively she opened her mouth, and she was chewing and swallowing it down, mashed potatoes and gravy. When they was done, he put a cup of water tentatively to her lips, and she sipped it. It was the first movement she was conscious of making, and when the man wiped her lips, and she listened to the door close, she remembered. She'd taken a drug overdose. She hadn't wanted to live any more. Evidently, it had gone wrong. And as the day passed, and thoughts and feelings came in like clouds do on the horizon, she laid almost perfectly still. She could barely move. She wasn't sure what had happened, but it appeared her motor functioning skills just didn't work. And as the day turned to night, her sight and hearing began to focus in. She could almost see perfectly the room around her now, as the nurse came and gave her a second drip. And she could hear perfectly well. Okay, Courtney, we've done the first lot. I just need to flush out that cannula, and we'll get that second bag through you. Everything's going to be okay, my dear. You'll be fine. You're in safe hands here. Courtney didn't realise until she was already doing it. She was smiling. Oh, that's gorgeous. So nice to see you smiling. Do you want the radio on or anything? Courtney was able to mouth the word that came out as a slow whisper. No. Okay, dear. We'll be in a bit. We'll come and get you a bit more comfortable in that bed. Thanks, Courtney. The door closed, and Courtney was alone in the room. It was dark, except for a lone bedlight above her head, illuminating her. And that smile remained. Unable to move in a hospital bed, having fluids pumped through her and unable to control her bowel movements, she was happy. For the first time in a year, she didn't feel scared. She felt safe. She closed her eyes and allowed the stress that had lived above her eyes move away with a funny squelch. She remembered how she had done it then. Fentanyl, an opioid. She tried to kill herself by reaching heaven first, but it hadn't worked. She didn't know her future, but in that moment it didn't matter. If she was to remain in this state for the rest of her life, because even though the suicide had not been a success, her intentions had been, she was away from him. She was safe. Courtney then fell into the deepest sleep she would ever fall into in her life. The next morning she was woken by a man standing at the end of her bed in blue scrubs. "Hello, Courtney. I've come to see how you're doing." It was daytime, and though there was no indication, she could tell he was a doctor by the tone of his voice and his bone structure, and his waspy glasses. It all felt 2 generations away from aristocracy. "Now, Courtney, I know you're struggling to communicate right now, but you're going through what we believe is called a fentanyl-induced brain hypoxia. Now, the good news is, you will almost certainly make a full recovery. It's just a question of when. People can be feeling the effects for months, but, with the brain fog and etc. But if everything is as we expect, I would expect to see you walking by the end of the week. We just need to keep you hydrated, keep you eating. When you're a little better, maybe we'll have a little talk about your usage. Anyway, thanks, Courtney," he said with a thumbs up that didn't suit his class. As she lay there in the silence of the room, she smiled. It would have been a laugh, but her motor responses wasn't strong enough yet to do that. "He thinks I'm a drug addict. Me," she mused. It wasn't like that. It was my first time. One big hit. From what I read, it was more than enough to kill 10 of me. Perhaps it wasn't as strong as I was told. I don't know how all this works. Maybe they, cut it down like coke? God knows, she thought. A kind man came in later and fed her gravy and mash and banana and custard for pudding. And quite content, after he wiped her lips, she drifted off again. She was woken by a knock on the door. Slowly her eyelids opened, and she watched 2 young children enter the room, a boy and a girl. It was then, to her horror, she realised they were hers. She had completely forgot about their existence. In that moment, she felt not human, something abstract. How does someone forget about their children? A boy of about 7 and a girl 10. Pretty children, smiling at her. She went to say sorry, but the word didn't come out. Then he came in. The second he did, her heart began to race. If she had been hooked up to the obs machine, it would have resulted in doctors running in to see what was happening, but she wasn't. She was hit by a feeling that was the antithesis of the opioid high that had sent her here. His bald head and goatee beard glared at her with the dark eyes that was always piercing. "Look at the state of you," he said, closing the door. He had brought in a chair, and he placed it by her bed. "Why on earth would you do this to your kids? You're no mother, are you?" Suddenly, her motor functions were half working. She writhed and wriggled in the bed, trying to move down it, with every ounce of effort she could muster. As she did, the hospital gown came down, and her breast was exposed. "Look at you! Do you not even care? In front of your children!" She was sweating profusely. She was screaming inside, trying to, but her lungs could not make the noise. She wriggled down the bed and got her ankles past the bed rails, getting a part of her legs off the bed. "This is your mother, kids. I want you to see her today for what she really is." Her legs were half off the bed now. "What on earth are you trying? You obviously can't walk, can you? For God's sake!" he said, getting up and leaving the room. God. She could hear that voice that had frightened her for so long, that wouldn't let her leave the house for a year, or anyone visit. She heard him talk to others, the way she thought was only for her. "Oi, you! Come here now. My wife needs some help." She knew it was going to hurt, but she allowed her hips to drop off the bed, and her head followed. colliding with the hard hospital floor. Slowly she looked up, naked, with only the gown holding loosely round her neck. She looked at her two children, who looked down at her, standing instinctively close to one another. "Sorry," she whispered. "What on earth has happened in here?" said a nurse. "Well, she's obviously got out of bed, hasn't she?" he said. But she could barely move." "Yeah, and that's why she's fell, isn't it? Are you going to help her up or what?" "I just need to go get some help." "Oh, for crying out loud, really? Right, here," he said, walking towards her. "Sir, no, you can't do that. We need to go get a hoist." "What? Oh, whatever. Come on, kids. We'll wait outside." As a nurse and two healthcare assistants helped Courtney, bleeding, back into bed, staff watched the man outside her room, laughing and joking with his two children, play fighting. "It just doesn't feel right, does it? 40 years old, takes an overdose, and him. I don't blame her," said the staff nurse behind the nurse's desk. "No, I'll get onto it," said another nurse.